Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be talking about Watergate today, everybody's favorite presidential scandal, though we've had a few since then. But this is going to cover the 1970s for the most part, the Nixon and Ford years. We will talk about President Carter in the next lecture, so the early to mid 70s, I guess you could say. And of course, we're going to start with Richard Nixon. He was elected in 1968 by a pretty wide margin, and then again in 1972. He was extremely popular. You may recall he was Eisenhower's vice president. He lost out to Kennedy, but here he is back 8 years later. And his main platform during the election was in '68 was to end the war and win the peace. And by 1968, that's what everyone wanted. In fact, the war was so unpopular that Lyndon Johnson elected not to run again. He was eligible to, but he knew there was no way he was going to win. So he stepped out because he was so unpopular, because the war was so unpopular. So despite anything that had happened on the civil rights side, remember we had the Civil Rights Act and a bunch of other things going on like that, all that great society stuff, Vietnam overshadowed everything. And honestly, Vietnam will overshadow Nixon too until the scandal happens during his second term. So those of you that are old enough to remember when President Obama was elected back in 2008, you can understand the problem that Nixon ran into because it's a very similar problem to the one Obama ran into. And that was, he said, we're going to get out of this war in the Middle East. Nixon said, we're going to get out of this war in Vietnam. And then when they became president and the realities of the situation hit, we didn't just step out of the war in either case. We're still in the war in the Middle East. Now things have changed. But President Obama tried to pull troops out. Things got crazy. He had to put more troops in. Exactly the same thing happened in Vietnam. You know the old saying, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it? There's a classic example. It's really, really hard to just step out of a war zone. You either have to win crushingly, and then it takes a while, of course, to roll out, or you have to just walk out, and no one does that. Although in Vietnam, basically that's what will end up happening because Nixon will get overwhelmed and overcome by this Watergate stuff. But by that point, the war is mostly over. We mostly just gave up. So very popular sentiment to end the war and win the peace. He's just going to have a hard time doing that. So he'll say, okay, we're going to pull troops. And then a month later, we're adding troops, again, very much like President Obama did. And we bomb a lot. I think your film says we bombed more in Vietnam than we dropped bombs in the entirety of World War II. And that's crazy. But anyway, the war is still hugely unpopular, as you could imagine. He's also dealing with an economy that's starting to slow down. So we started to see that a little bit in the 60s. The 50s, it was booming. It was crazy. We don't really spend a lot of time talking economics in this part of the class because they're just crazy good after World War II, right? We talk about them when they're really bad, like in the Great Depression, but then all that was cured. Everyone was working. Unemployment was super low. And then we had some challenges in the 60s with education and technology and whatever. Those things haven't really changed. And so the economy is starting to slow down. We're going to see wages starting to stagnate. The government's going to institute price freezes and things like that. And that is really messing with the system that's not supposed to have those things happen. So we're going to run into some major problems. And those problems are going to continue on through the next several years. Several presidents, including Ronald Reagan in the 80s, are going to be dealing with this kind of problematic economy. So also there's competition from abroad. Some of it has to do with maybe some of the deals we've signed. But in any case, this is the background for the war in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal, which happens later. And then later into all that is probably Nixon's greatest successes, which are his foreign policy successes, in particular having to do with Russia and China. And I'll get to those a little bit more in a minute. He does resign on August 9th, 1974. Nixon is the only president ever to have resigned his post as president in the middle of a term. And he did so because he knew that he was going to be impeached, and this was basically the best way to get through it. So his foreign policy legacy probably is the thing that should stand out. Again, it all gets overshadowed by Watergate. Watergate was a bad, bad scandal. But his focus was always foreign policy. It's kind of what he did as vice president and, again, as president. So basically, as I said earlier, he does really end the war in Vietnam. Now, it technically sort of peters on for another year or so, and we just sort of left. Politically, the war became untenable, and we just left, and unfortunately, South Vietnam basically collapsed. But he and Henry Kissinger, his foreign policy guy, actually did get some deals done on that. What he really is known for is this fancy word called détente, which is another word for having a better relationship or being friends with Russia and with China. Nixon's really the first president to conceive the idea that Russia and China aren't the same. Remember in the Cold War lecture, I had the list where you have Russia, China, North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, Yugoslavia, all these countries, and they're communist, and then everybody else was not communist. And we treated all the communists the same, and it was like the Soviet Union was running this sort of communist cabal, and that they had the secret plan to turn the world into communist. I'm not saying that the Russians didn't want to do that. We would like to turn the whole world into some kind of form of republic, wouldn't we? But it wasn't as big or as top down as we thought, and so Nixon and Kissinger conceive of the idea that let's talk to the Russians and let's deal with Russian issues with Russia, and let's talk to China and deal with Chinese issues with China, and not lump them all together. And that was a big opening, and I think that's the beginning of the end of what, real communism as you would see it in the world, the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the end of China as a communist country. China's still a terrible dictatorship, don't misunderstand me. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia's run by the mob, basically, but it's not communist anymore. Both countries are far more open to trade and commerce, and that's maybe another reason why we haven't had a World War III, because countries are actually interested in making money. But this is one of Nixon's strengths. And again, it sets the stage for a lot of things that are going to happen in the future foreign policy-wise, where we have better relations with China and better relations with Russia and so on. And all that starts to come to fruition really in the 80s and 90s. So we're going to talk a little bit about Watergate. Watergate's this huge, big, long thing. I want to focus on the top line. The bottom line has to do with the FBI and some of the secret stuff that was going on behind the scenes, and the leak called Deep Throat and all this kind of stuff. We're going to focus more on the top line. And so basically what happens is during 1972's election year, some guys are caught breaking into some offices which are in this building called the Watergate Hotel. That's why this thing's called Watergate. And they get caught breaking into these Democratic Committee offices, and they're looking for information, and they're planting bugs. And of course, like all things in the justice system, they take a while to unfold, all right? Then you get this report in August of 1972 that some checks that were supposed to go to Nixon's campaign actually wound up in the bank account of some of these burglars, and everyone's radar goes off and goes, wait a second. And then you start getting investigations, right? The Washington Post reports that the FBI linked a bunch of stuff, and there's a connection. Nixon, of course, wins the 1972 election, not because of any of the stuff that happened here. He was going to win anyway. He won by a pretty good margin. So it's hard to say, of course. And so the questions start to come out, does Nixon know about it and so on? Well, then there's more burglaries and more of his people are convicted, and there's all these crazy stuff going on. And then so the Watergate hearings begin in May of 1973. So Nixon's already started his second term. He's dealing with all this foreign policy stuff. They're wrapping up or trying to wrap up Vietnam, and then this whole thing blows up, and it gets ugly really fast. Watergate's sort of famous for the tapes. You can see one of these old-time tape recorders down there. If you're not my age, in your later 40s or early 50s, you've probably never seen one of these things. My dad had one of these things. It's a reel-to-reel tape, not even cassettes. It's like an old movie. You just had the tape in these reels and went from one to the other. And yeah, they are recording stuff. The reality is Nixon recorded everything. Uh, Lyndon Johnson recorded stuff. Kennedy recorded stuff. Eisenhower recorded stuff. A lot of guys recorded stuff, but Nixon kind of recorded everything. And so these tapes will become a real central figure in this investigation. And at first, there's this investigation. This guy named Jaworski is appointed to look into things. You may remember Robert Mueller was appointed to look into this Russian collusion stuff. Ken Starr was appointed to look into the stuff with Bill Clinton back in the 90s. So this is something that actually happens often. You just don't usually hear much about it. But in any case, they're asking questions. This panel wants paperwork. Nixon refuses to turn in paperwork. He says, nope, executive privilege, there's top secret stuff. And then the tapes are learned about, and so they want the tapes. And someone basically said, yeah, Nixon knows about it, so they want the tapes because the tapes would be proof that Nixon talked about it or ordered it or knew about it. Because if Nixon did, then he's out. He's going to get impeached because he'll be guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, as this thing unfolds, it's like a snowball rolling downhill. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and nobody quite knows what to do. But the longer this goes on, Nixon was up here in popularity, and he just goes down, 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 down. And understand, this is unfolding on television, right? So the Vietnam War is unfolding on television. This Watergate scandal, the hearings, it's on the news every night. They're being played during the day when they can. Transcripts of everything is coming out of the newspaper. So this is something that everyone's seeing every day and kind of being pounded with. And Nixon just says, look, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not a criminal, yada, yada. But ultimately, as you can see, July, August 1974, the Supreme Court says, you got to hand over the tapes. You got to give us the paperwork they're wanting. And so, and the House is kind of already starting impeachment. They're going to get in. They're going to try to impeach him for obstruction of justice, misuse of the powers of the office, and failure to obey a subpoena. So, you're probably sort of familiar with the impeachment process. It's not easy to impeach someone, to actually get them out of office, but there is a process there. Not too many presidents have been impeached. There have been 4, I guess. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, although that never actually went to that point. And then, of course, Trump was impeached too. But remember, it doesn't mean you get removed from office. None of those guys were removed from office. It was just it's a House vote. The Senate did not follow in any of those cases. So anyway, Nixon, it's all blown up in his face. I don't know that anyone actually knows how much he knew. He died in 1994. So for 20 years, he basically kept a low profile. I used to see him on TV. I'd be watching football on Sunday afternoon with my dad and my brother, and maybe the 49ers would be playing in New York, and there would be Richard Nixon and a couple of security guys kind of hanging out. But he kind of becomes a pariah. Nobody wants to be around him. By the time the summer of 1974 comes around, he's so unpopular, basically everyone around him has distanced themselves as far as they can. So he resigns. And again, it's still a hot topic today. Notice the term gate is attached to a lot of scandals, even scandals in football and other arenas. So Watergate always brings up scandal. So if you can make something sound like Watergate, well, it automatically attaches it to Watergate. In the end, there were something like 18 minutes missing from a tape, and that basically made it impossible for him to get out of this. There is a professor, I don't know if he's still there, but he was at Texas A&M Central Texas over here, and his thesis work, and he continues to digitize all of the Nixon tapes. And he said there are thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, and they're transcribing them and digitizing them for the future. And of course, he writes books out of them. And, he said they've not found anything, although some of the tapes are still under lock and key. He did tell us, I went to hear him speak one time, that he got a call. It was several years ago when he was in school working on this stuff. Because when you're getting your PhD, you have to basically come up with something new and do this research and then write a book about it. And that's what he was doing. And he gets a call from Henry Kissinger's office. Remember, Kissinger was Nixon's foreign policy guy. And so here we are, it's years probably. I can't remember the year he said he was doing it, but I'm going to assume it's the early, mid 2000s or maybe late 2000s when this guy was working on it. And Henry Kissinger's office calls him and says, he wants to talk to you. And like nobody talks to Henry Kissinger. So the guy makes an appointment. He's got to fly to New York. Well, he realizes later on that he also had a different appointment that same day, which was his wedding. So now he has to decide, do I go see Kissinger? Because if I don't, he may never speak to me again. Or am I going to go ahead and get married? Because if I don't, she may never speak to me again, right? Of course, he gets married. He does the wise thing. He gets married, rescheduled, goes and flies out to see Kissinger. He said he gets ushered into this dark office, and Kissinger's kind of sitting in this chair with a whiskey or something in his hand, and he goes and he told us, he said, I didn't know if I was going to walk out of there. I didn't know if I was going to get bumped off or whatever. But basically, he said the conversation was very short, and Kissinger just told him to stop what he's doing, to not drag all this stuff up. So, that might mean there's something in there. I don't know. At the point where he had talked to us, nothing major. Basically, he has people calling him wanting to know what's on there, people that have some kind of connection to it, but that's it. So Nixon resigns. That means Gerald Ford, the vice president, will become the president. The funny thing about Gerald Ford is he was not elected the vice president either. He was appointed to become the vice president in 1973. A guy named Spiro Agnew was Nixon's vice president. But he got hit with all kinds of allegations for when he was governor of New Jersey and things that extended maybe into his time as vice president, and including tax evasion. And he ends up pleading guilty to tax evasion. I mean, you do know how powerful the IRS is, right? They caught Al Capone. They didn't get him for murder. They got him for tax evasion. They didn't get him for racketeering or any of those things. They got him for tax evasion. And he went to jail. Well, Agnew resigned, and Gerald Ford was appointed to be the vice president. Well, then when Nixon resigned a year later, nearly, then Gerald Ford becomes the president. So Ford's the only president who never got elected into that position, either one of those positions. So imagine being Gerald Ford and the whole country just looking at him going, you're not a real president. And that's basically how a lot of people felt. And it really hurts him when he actually pardons Nixon a few months or weeks later. Now, Gerald Ford basically claimed, look, I pardoned him because I couldn't get anything done. All anybody wanted to talk about was Nixon and what's going to happen with Nixon, yada, yada, yada. And so I pardoned him so that we could move on. He could move on, the country could move on, and I could move on. And of course, most people, or a lot of people, saw this as a political move, that he was really just, being a Republican, right? Taking care of other Republicans. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, right? And some people call this another corrupt bargain. If you were in 1301 with me, remember we discussed the corrupt bargain where Andrew Jackson labeled the deal that was supposedly made between John Quincy Adams, the incoming president, and Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. And remember that election ended up in a tie, so it went to the House of Representatives. And so basically Henry Clay made sure that John Quincy Adams won, and in return, Henry Clay became Secretary of State. And so Jackson called that the corrupt bargain. A lot of people think that this might have happened too, that, again, Nixon told Ford, hey, I'll resign, you can be president, and then you can pardon me. There's no evidence for that, but of course people think that. So Gerald Ford has this pretty short presidency. He will run again in 1976. Obviously, he will lose. Can you imagine how unpopular he was after pardoning Nixon? Keep in mind also, Vietnam sort of peters out during this period of time, and the economy is still getting worse. And so he's not going to be able to get reelected. And we'll talk about the next election in the next lecture. But the last thing here, we're going to talk about hippies, or the counterculture, just really quick. And of course, this goes back to the 60s. You don't really see much of this in the 50s. Remember, the 50s are constrained by fear and paranoia, and when you get fear and paranoia, a lot of the time, what you get is conformity. And I think I talked about this in previous lecture. If not, here it is. But people kind of dress the same, they kind of talk the same, they kind of have the same interests, they kind of look the same. It's a little strange if you look at 1950s pictures or television or anything like that. But then the 60s, this new generation just kind of blows that open, and they just said, we don't like the way things are going, we want to do things different. So these younger Americans start pushing back against their parents' choices, and they wanted a different world. There were big issues going on. Now, some of them kind of go pretty far away, and they just deny all the sort of basic American sort of Christian values, right? Like marriage and all this kind of stuff. And they start to deny that, and they'll live in communes. And the problem with that is living in a commune sounds a lot like communism, and it has a lot of similarities, and it doesn't really work ever. Just try to find a time in history where this has worked, and you won't. I have an uncle who lived in a commune for a little while. He was a hippie. He lived in he went to college at Oregon State in Corvallis, and is my father's little brother. And he married a hippie who went to Cal Berkeley in California, and they're not hippies anymore. They got jobs and had kids and are responsible people. But it's kind of interesting. But, his time on the commune was not long, and it was fueled by sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And that's basically what these people would do. And so they're kind of denying all the 1940, 30s, 40s, and 50s, this kind of structure of society, and saying, we don't want that anymore. We're going to blow all that up. Also, they were protesting big issues like the one you see here, nukes make me sick, nuclear proliferation. Now, the truth is, yes, we've been developing bigger ones. The Russians been developing bigger ones. China's been developing bigger ones. To a lesser degree, France and England, and later a couple other countries. I think there's 8 or 9 countries now that have them. Most of them can't really deploy them, though, and that's what the Cold War is about, right? Is that possibility? But Kennedy, I don't know about Eisenhower, but Kennedy for sure, and Nixon, they all got treaties signed that were designed to limit nuclear arms, like the SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation, and treaties were signed where we're not going to detonate actual nuclear bombs anymore on the surface of the earth, and all these different treaties. Those are done, but a lot of these people are protesting this idea of nuclear war, and we should get rid of that. You've probably heard the one, make love, not war, right? But there's other big issues. Civil rights is a huge issue. So a lot of these folks are going to be protesting, one side or the other, civil rights. But usually these folks are going to be protesting for civil rights. And of course, they're protesting the Vietnam War. Everybody was protesting the Vietnam War. And there were lots of other issues they could have protested. One of the problems that develops as you get through the 60s and into the 70s is they start to grow up, and out of that, the group that kind of follows them aren't necessarily as much dedicated to the causes as they might have been dedicated to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so they kind of get stuck in that. And then pretty soon they're protesting everything. And when you're protesting everything, you're kind of protesting nothing. And so the hippies in the 70s are like burnout drug addicts almost. It's almost a joke, like a costume for Halloween, right? And groovy and all that stuff. The hippies kind of in the 60s more were activists, and I think were probably looking to change things. And then they kind of go away in the 80s. You don't really see a whole lot of that anymore. Now we got hipsters and woke people and all this other stuff, but you can see some similarities there, I think. So that's it for the lecture. The next lecture is going to cover the last part of the 70s and most of the 80s, and I call it Iran so far away. And Iran, unfortunately, does figure a large part into the picture in the late 70s and the 80s. So come back and watch that video in the next couple of days. I'll have it up.